Have you ever not slept for so long that you started hallucinating? What was your experience? Okay, story time. My mom suffers from narcolepsy, and one of the first treatments they gave her basically drove her also completely insane. She was up for 5 days. One day, I walked into her bedroom hearing her talking to someone. I look around and ask her who she's talking to, and she tells me the lady in red. There's no one in the room at all, just us. I ask where is the lady, and she says the lady sits on the dresser and talks to her all night. I was like 14 at the time, so I went to the kitchen and hid her medicine until my stepdad got home and could take her to the hospital. The ER doctor was super upset about the meds her doctor had given her. It was way too much. Anyway, she stopped seeing the lady after they got all that straightened out. Edit. Alright, I'm gonna say it. Wow, this blew up. Thank you all for your thoughtful and kind wishes for my mom. She does have good days and bad days. Her narcolepsy is caused by a small tumor on her brain. She gets better when it shrinks and worse when it grows. It gets to about the size of a dime sometimes. They can't remove it, but are trying to keep it shrunk with medicine. Story 2. I stayed up for 3 days straight when I was 17. On the third day, I kept hearing people call my name as if they wanted to ask me a question. It didn't help that I also thought it would be a good idea to go to school that day. Multiple times a day, I would bolt upright and look around to see who wanted my attention, only to see my fellow students huddled over their work. It got worse as the day went. My friends were a little worried about how weird I was acting. I walked home after school, listening to my headphones as usual, but I still kept hearing someone call my name. The music made it worse. Whatever I was hearing was already kind of muffled, and having a song playing in my ears only seemed to obscure it more. When I finally got home, I told my mom I wasn't feeling well, went to my room, and went straight to sleep. At 4 in the afternoon, as I nodded off, I heard that voice calling for me again, making me jerk out of my sleep. This repeated a couple times until I convinced myself that I already told my mom I was sick and if she really needed me, she could come get me. I finally went to sleep and didn't wake until 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, and then went to sleep afterwards again until 9 a.m. the next day. I was an idiot. Story 4. It's almost a regular occurrence for me now because I suffer from insomnia. There are 3 different types of hallucinations for me. 1. Funny, useless crap I know is fake. 2. Crap that could be real or not. And 3. Extremely crazy and traumatic crap I know is fake, but rattles me up every single time. Usually they appear in that order. Pro tip, if you're experiencing visual hallucinations and you aren't sure whether something is real or not, take a photo with your smartphone and look at that. It's very unlikely that you hallucinate the same crap twice and in the exact same position. Works for me, at least. So I have no intention of ever being so delirious that I'm hallucinating, but that's actually, tip 3 is very smart. If you are conscious enough in that process to remember to pull your phone out and take a photo, that is a great idea to know if you're losing your mind or not. Story 6. Oh, I have a great cautionary tale for this. Me, 19, freshly sent to Japan for the USAF. A little pretext here. Japan is famous for the car culture there, and it inspires hundreds of thousands of people. One particular multi-track circuit that's incredibly famous is called the Bisu Circuit, and it has a festival a few times a year called Drift Matsuri. This particular event draws drivers and spectators from around the world to thrash their cars for 72 hours straight for one cheap price. Influencers fly in and buy a car for the week a lot, and it is important. I can't remember what caused me to stay up all night. I might have been gaming, or I might have been studying. But it was Matsuri weekend at Ibisu, and Adam LZ, famous drift YouTuber, was gonna be there with Taylor Ray. With Alicia being just around 150 kilometers away, I started my car and set out on my journey. I had never used the tolls before, so I ended up driving 7 hours instead of the originally predicted 3. I was also freshly imported into Japan and had yet to take my car on a true dive through the Japanese country, so I trucked on through single-lane roads through rice paddies and small mountain villages. Honestly, not the kind of place my drift car was suited for, but it was dope. I ended up getting into the circuit at like 3:30, met the crew and hung out for a while. Practiced on the skid pad, but I had to get back to base before 12. I stayed for an hour and turned around and went home. I had been awake for close to 64 hours at that point. I really didn't have any issues until about 10:30, back in the thick concrete jungle of Tokyo. I had a few hallucinations, but the worst was where I drove my car into a hole in the middle of the road. I was out for at least a few seconds, probably sleeping. I'm fortunate that the roads were next to empty around me, but I could have died that night, and everyone around me was in danger. Do yourself and everyone around you a favor. Don't drive tired. Story 7. There were 2 incidents where I had auditory hallucination. 1. I took a child development class my junior year of high school. I had to bring home and take care of the plastic baby. However, it always needed to be cared for at night instead of during the daytime. And during the daytime, I would need to complete my homework, chores, care for my siblings or grandparents, etc. I think I got less than 2 hours of sleep in 2 or 3 days, and I always dreamt of the baby going off. When I would wake up, I couldn't tell if the baby was actually crying or if it was in my dreams and head. It freaked me out so much. My grandmother found me one night, crying and holding the plastic baby in my arms. She asked what was wrong, and I responded with that my brother, who was a baby at the time, was crying because I hurt him and didn't know how to help him. I hallucinated that the plastic baby was my brother and that he was crying in pain. The plastic baby wasn't even crying. I told my mom and her husband about this after I returned the baby because I was scared beyond belief. They said it was perfectly normal once you have children, so I guess I'm never having children if it'll drive me insane. That sucks because I really wanted kids, but I would only end up being a danger to myself and them because they would leave me so sleep deprived. 2. It was during the summer my sophomore year of high school. I, of course, stayed up extremely late. I didn't even feel tired, but apparently my brain was because all of a sudden I hear heavy breathing outside my bedroom door. It then followed with a cry for help, asking for someone to please help them, and they were after them. The breathing was heavy, and the voice sounded strangled, struggling to breathe. That freaked me out too, but it was because I thought it was my grandmother, who slept next to my room. It didn't sound like her, but I was still worried about her. I woke my grandmother up to see if she was okay, and she said everything was fine. Story 8. Okay, here's my story. I stayed up for 105 hours once, would not recommend, and will never do it again. The why is that I'm not really sure. Circumstances led to me being up for about 50, and I got it into my head that I wanted to see how far I could go. I started getting mild hallucinations at about 80, and it just got worse from there. At about 90, a couple friends came over to my place because they hadn't seen me in a couple days. They found me sitting on my bed watching a pile of socks dancing around the room. They, being the good friends that they are, decided that they couldn't just leave me in that state, so they both took a few hits of acid so they could join me. A few hours later, we're in different corners of my apartment watching the patterns on the wall do stuff. Personally, I was watching a parade of circus animals. Suddenly, over the radio, the song The Safety Dance started playing. As one, the 3 of us broke away from the walls and started doing the safety dance around the room. I'm not sure who started it, but someone started stripping off clothes, and soon we're all naked and dancing around the apartment. After about 15 minutes of that, we decided to take it outside. The next hour or so was taken up by dancing a naked safety dance around the neighborhood. Lord knows how we didn't get arrested. Fortunately, one of my friends came to her senses and talked the rest of us into going back home, where we proceed to eat all the food in my fridge and beat up on a piñata that I'd brought for my sister's birthday. I ended up passing out not too long after my friends came down from their trip. They just looked so peaceful. I had to join the cuddle, and didn't last long once I hit the pillow. I think I slept about 15 hours after that. Narrator's commentary. Yeah, that sounds absolutely miserable. At any point in my life, even my young, reckless adolescent self would never stay awake that long, but how much of this, I'm curious, can be attributed to the acid trip? I'm just wondering on that. Story 9. I've suffered from insomnia since early childhood. In high school, because of the pressure to do well and keep up with the workload, I had long nights and early mornings to get to school on time. One particular week, I went 7 days with only 5 hours of sleep throughout. I went to my first period class one day and started seeing people that weren't there, like fellow students, ones that hadn't come to school that day or didn't even have that class with me. Next period, I saw the clock's hands moving quickly, like you see in time lapses, and got up to go to lunch. My teacher yelled at me saying class just started. When I got in my car to go to lunch, my steering wheel started to melt and those heat wave things were generating around it. I called the hotel my mom worked at to ask her to come and get me and forgot what I called for. I ended up trying to book a room until the person on the other end said, "Daughter, is that you?" I was like, oh crap. Mom, will you pick me up and take me to my hotel room? Do not disallow yourself to sleep. God, if I could sleep like any normal person, I would be doing that crap right now. Get some sleep, OP. Don't experiment with no sleep. It's not fun or cool or good for your brain. Story 10. I went about a week without sleep in architecture college. There were some naps there, but never deep sleep until the end. I kept drifting out of reality and would act as if I was on dream logic. There were moments of lucidity that I had to cling onto. 24 hours was just some visual flickerings and glare from lights. 48 hours was things moving in a sort of inertia that my head moved. Like if I looked to the right, everything would sort of keep moving to the right. Started hearing mumbling. 72 hours, light hurt me. Started drifting in and out periodically. Some of the dreams would be too real that I would confuse them with reality briefly. 96 hours, I had to struggle to keep my lucidity. I had to force myself to think, there's a person to my right, there's a laptop in front of me. And when I drifted away from those concrete thoughts, so too did my sense of surroundings. Was hearing voices in a talking level. Was feeling like I was being touched or poked. 120 hours, and every beat of my heart caused my senses to full and drift. I couldn't keep my focus easily between moving my hand, poor motor controls, and visually looking. I was unable to understand what people were saying to me. It all kept breaking apart in my head and not forming into cognitive sentences. 144 hours and I couldn't move. There was pain in every part of the body, and parts my disoriented brain thought was my body. I never knew I could feel pain in a non-existent appendage. I kept drifting away into what felt like a dream with slight attachment to reality, feeling all the pain throughout. 168 hours and I couldn't even think. I felt vegetative and my sense of cognition dulled to that of a sea sponge. I had no idea where I was or what I was doing. I lost sense of self and my connection to reality. I was a fog of collective lights and strands of light, pushing and pulling sensation. I think during this last day, there were only maybe an hour or two of college homework I couldn't even get done, and I ended up throwing it out because it was just a mess of lines and chipboard. I spent the first 3 days just out cold, aside from a few meals or taking pain meds. The next few weeks trying to recover from the sleep debt, and years later I'm still affected with stuff like N24 or regular sleep patches. Lesson learned, kids. Always get at least 4 hours of sleep if you're crunching, and make that debt up soon. It is not worth it. Story 11. This was back when I was a senior in high school and in running start. My schedule was packed with 0-hour classes before school and whatever sport I was doing after. This, plus the bout of insomnia I was dealing with at the time, made me pretty much like a walking zombie. I remember hallucinating a couple times in class, but there's one time that I still think about every once in a while. I was sitting in one of those big lecture chemistry classes learning about electrons. I remember thinking that someone was stealing electrons from the whiteboard as the teacher was drawing diagrams and giving examples. There wasn't a lot of reasoning behind it, but all my brain could process was that there was an electron on the board. Then there wasn't, so someone must have been taking them. It was pretty frustrating because I couldn't even figure out where they were going. My notes from that class were complete gibberish. I'm not sure how, but I passed the class in the end. Most of the hallucinations from a lack of sleep that I've experienced were just my brain trying to fill in gaps or make sense of whatever was going on. This might not be the type of hallucinating you're looking for in your question. My eyes would basically accept what my sleep-deprived brain logic was telling them. My sleep schedule has gotten much better since then. Story 12. Have done 4+ days without sleep a few times. Not recommended. Here's the worst. Hadn't slept for 5 days straight. Don't do drugs, kids. Was working full-time running a bar. That explains the drugs. And going to school full-time in the mornings. Went outside to get on my motorcycle, and when I turned it on, the headlight wasn't the same color it was before. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a bunch of colors all bleeding together. Looked at the garage door and it was being lit up in a way I can't really describe. It was like I was seeing new colors that didn't exist. There was weird halos and rings around the edges, and the white light outside my house was no longer white. It was a weird rainbow color mixture. Definitely should have went back inside and went to sleep, but I hopped on and rode the hour down the interstate to my school and was only able to make it half the day before I had to leave. Fell asleep on my bike the way home. On the highway doing 100+ mph and almost rear-ended a semi. Haven't stayed awake more than a day since and don't plan to anytime soon. Effing miserable experience. Story 13. I was in the hospital with a very angry case of Crohn's disease flaring up. It was my first time on painkillers, and we learned the hard way that I'm a rapid metabolizer and that I don't process opioids like most people. Also, instead of making me feel warm and fuzzy or loopy, or whatever they do to other people, they just keep me awake. They did help knock down my pain, but they kept me wide awake. It was literally day 5, and I was begging for some Benadryl or something to just knock me the hell out. I was hallucinating people coming in and out of my room that weren't there, and at one point I wandered out of my room and made my way down to the emergency room where, as a police officer, I would often stop in during work and chit-chat with the staff. Apparently I was down there in my gown with my IV pull, having a very casual conversation with all the staff. With the exact same demeanor, I would have to be standing around in uniform. And the staff thought it was hilarious. Story 14. Yep, first deployment in the Navy. On a submarine, you're a NUB for non-useful body until you're qualified to stand watches and earn your submarine warfare insignia, aka fish. During this time, you're also not allowed, by tradition, not formally, much free time. So no movies, music, reading, for fun, tech manuals are encouraged, or any real leisure activity. Hell, you're not even allowed ice cream or cookies most of the time. So I had barely been sleeping, working my ass off to get qualified, so it would make my life better as well as the lives of others on board. Also, O2 levels are kept fairly low. Atmospheric is roughly 19 to 21%. We keep it around 17.5 or so. Less strain on the oxygen generators, easier to sleep, and slower fire progression if one broke out. Anywho, I'm chilling in the machinery room, where the emergency diesel, O2 generators, and the scrubbers and burners were, working on a checkout with the watchstander. All of a sudden, I look to my right, and the aft end of the space just lengthens into a tunnel, similar to the one from Ghostbusters under NYC. I go to take a step, and there's a slight step down. I stumble over it, nearly faceplate the deck plate, and twist my ankle. Decided at that point I needed to get some shut-eye. Story 15. During basic, we did a long stint without sleep. We dug a bunch of trenches and had to stay awake waiting for an attack that would never come. I thought I saw movement ahead of us. It wasn't clearly people coming at me, more like shadows and faint light were moving in unnatural ways. More like the dark scenery was bubbling and my mind was interpreting it as movement. Knowing I was tired and knowing that hallucinations can occur when you've been without sleep, I couldn't tell if my mind was playing tricks or if instructors were sneaking in the shadows and my eyes couldn't focus in the dark. Asked my trench buddy if I was seeing things, and he confirmed whatever I was seeing was in my head. It wasn't so much a hallucination and more like what happens when you stare at a magic eye picture for too long. Rather than hallucinations, I would describe it as your eyes playing tricks on you, except it won't stop and you have the decision-making faculties of a person who's blackout drunk. Yeah, I think that's the biggest hazard here, is not necessarily what you see, but the fact that you aren't in the right state of mind to act rationally and can end up doing something dangerous. So please get sleep, people. Story 16. Not me, but my husband. I went into labor late at night and was in labor for 30 hours before actual birth. The night before, we had no sleep either because I had false labor. He was an absolute trooper and did and said everything I needed him to the entire time without fail. Then, after 2 nights in the hospital, with a total of maybe 4 hours of sleep, we went home with a newborn. If you're a parent, you know how that goes. He told me years later, when we arrived at the hospital, he was in physical pain from the sleep deprivation, and the next few days were the hardest of his life. Not just because of becoming a father, either. Looking back, I vaguely remember walking down the halls of the hospital trying to get contractions going, and he would randomly collapse into a wall and catch himself. Women's bodies are built to endure that type of thing, I guess, because I was tired for sure, but it wasn't that bad. Story 17. On the flight back from my holiday, I couldn't read English. I had been in Southeast Asia for a month, and I had just traveled for 24 hours by bus. Then I think about another 18 by plane, and I was trying to read the menu or pamphlets. I thought it was in another language at first, but realized I was just tired and overstimulated. The letter looked like nothing I had seen before. Even when I concentrated on it, I couldn't read it. I've hallucinated many times when on drugs, but because I'm on drugs, it's easy to understand that. I'm hallucinating because I'm on drugs. When I was like 18, and I had stayed awake Friday and Saturday night because I had used meth, and I went to two different parties. I was walking home on a Sunday morning with a friend, and I say to him, I can hear another party. And he replies with, nah, it's because you're high on meth. You're hearing things. I felt a little pissed off because he dismissed me like that, but he was right. It's a nice reminder to not do meth. Story 18. No, I remember when Halo Reach came out, and I stayed up a minimum of 3 days. And I stayed up 3 days for college twice, so those were long. I want to say 4 was my max, but I cannot do that anymore. I've just my entire life been able to stay up long periods of time without the need for sleep. I still go 2 to 3 days every now and then. I just don't want to sleep. I'm not an insomniac or anything. People here say they heard people call their name. I just have that daily, so I wouldn't tell the difference. Not saying I'm insane. My name is Mike. It causes me to just hear other people being called. As well, I think I've heard it so much from so many people that other names like Mark or just other words sound so alike at this point that I end up responding to them all, even if people are confused. So maybe I have. Only hallucination I've had was sleep paralysis. First time I was scared. Second I was, but the third time I actually wasn't. Like, I confronted it in my mind, and that caused it to last much longer. Sleep paralysis is quite cool, if I'm honest. Scary as crap, but cool. Yeah, man, you need to see a doctor. This is not normal. Please, don't fight the urge to sleep. Just go to bed, man. Please. Please. Story 19. Holy F, yes, I have. When I was 19, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces. For my BIQ, we spent a hot June day digging ourselves some trenches. We then spent the evening doing exercises, then retiring to our trenches for watch overnight. We were told OP4 would be attacking and to remain vigilant. OP4 was our sergeants throwing sims every 20 to 60 minutes while watching us through night vision. We spent the next day after no sleep, exercising, and doing ruck marches. It started raining that day. After that, it was back to our mud holes. Same crap the next night, occasional blank round fire and sims, with a superior appearing behind you every now and then to make sure you're awake. Physical training and exercises the next day, too. That third night, the goods. Sim started screaming and made me snap to and stare right at him as it went off 10 feet from my face. It was now snowing in June. My hands were so cold as I limply held my rifle. All I could do was stare at the ground in front of me, wishing I could die or sleep, whichever came first. I distinctly remember seeing imaginary enemies creeping in the distance. But the biggest hallucination I remember was the grass eating my hand and rifle. But when I moved my hand, it stayed where it was, but also got stuck to my head at the same time. That morning, we were given our 72 forced rest. Story 20. Yeah, so I had a 14-hour drive to Indiana from Texas. I was leaving at 10 p.m. and would arrive around noon or so the next day. I had just turned 20 and was pretty naive. I was supposed to be sleeping until an hour or two before I left, but I ended up waking up around 10 that morning with only a few hours of sleep because of anxiety and excitement. I would like to note that this wasn't an ordinary trip. I was driving to go pick up the girl of my dreams and bring her back down to Texas after we both thought she wouldn't be coming back. So I've made the drive, but around 7 a.m. the next morning, going almost a full day without sleep and driving for that long of a time without rest, I started tripping bad. Thought I was going too slow, my vision felt wrong, kept going and coming up to the point I thought that the only way I would be able to stay awake is if I sped there. And driving a Charger at the time, you can imagine how fast I was going. Going about 120, no problem, for well over an hour. Got there about 2 hours early and still couldn't sleep. Edibles did the trick though. Had a great night's sleep after that. Story 21. I was traveling from Thailand, having spent the last 4 months in Asia, to Australia. The last month was spent getting wrecked and partying almost every night. I'd calmed down a day or two before my flights and hoped to get into a routine. That didn't happen. Through one thing or another, I missed 2 connecting flights and was delayed by 24 hours. I had to spend this in the airport. As it got closer to my flight, the schedule was changed and I was bumped by an unspecified number of hours. I had to stay in the Qantas flight lounge and wait for my name to be called to tell me what my new flight details were. The following 10 or so hours were like I was tripping balls on mushrooms visually and just left a really loud nightclub audibly. ears ringing and slightly muffled hearing, but not in an enjoyable way. At one stage, I went to go across to the shop and walked straight into a large, plainly painted concrete wall, which for some reason I believed was a 7-Eleven. I hit myself hard and could not understand what had just happened. I spent the next hour talking absolute nonsense to security who believed I was drunk. It was the worst feeling ever. So tired. My brain eventually stopped working and I couldn't speak anymore. I tried to talk, but all that happened was I cried. I could feel the tears, but I couldn't find words. I remember all of it though, no fogginess or anything. I made it to Australia and slept for nearly 24 hours. I woke up with what can only be described as the worst hangover in the history of mankind, despite not having a drink for maybe 4 days previous. Headaches, sensitivity to light and load noise, an awful experience. I do not recommend. Story 22. It happened a few times, in fact. It's normal for me to see tracers and hallucinate when I'm sleepy, or have been woken up abruptly. When sleep deprived, I normally see a semi-transparent geometric pattern overlay, or a vortex when looking at something bright and plain. Sky, illuminated white wall, etc. The most annoying one was where, if I'd see a dot or fleck on something, my brain would trick me into seeing it spiral into place in the same motion every time, as if it had just landed there, even though it hadn't moved. This even applied to marks on my skin or punctuation on a page. It was really jarring. During a really unhealthy point, like several days with less than 5 hours of sleep, whilst taking stimulants round the clock, I saw some shadow people. Some of them was like a large, hunched figure that turned and strode toward me in my peripheral vision, but vanished when I looked to see what was there. The way it moved felt as if it was opportunistically trying to get me with my back turned. I knew it was a trick of the mind, so I didn't care. The final straw was when I was trying to fix me something to eat, and a shadowy figure crawled towards me on all fours like it was scrambling to possess me before it vanished. Soon after, in the very spot the creature disappeared, I randomly got into an argument with the person I was living with, and I briefly thought the creature might have orchestrated it. It was then that I realized I was in a bad way and needed to get some rest. Haven't been close to that tired since. Story 23. Former army dude and current night shift security guy here. This many times, especially when I was in the army doing all the super HOA stuff like pre-ranger and entertaining the fancies of West Point lieutenants. It's wild. When you hit your second night without sleep, your body starts doing weird stuff like randomly going limp and your heart rate starts going up by a lot, which is why you never ever try to stay awake with coffee or energy drinks after your first night. On the rare occasions I've made it to a third day without a reasonable period of sleep, I usually start the hallucinations. It's really hard to describe it, but I'd compare it to the feeling of having too many edibles. You can't focus on anything that's happened/happening 15 seconds before or after the present. The hallucinations are very dreamlike and very real. I remember looking into the woodline across from a tarmac, we were doing jumps over at 2 a.m., and seeing my high school crush's face in full, brightly lit color like it was being projected. Story 24. I had terrible insomnia and literally didn't get a wink of sleep in about 3 days. Near the end of the third day, I had to go to a fancy dinner. When talking to some colleagues I'd just met, the hallucinations kicked in. I went from being able to focus on our mundane conversation using all my concentration to dreaming part of the conversation in real time while awake. So I answered questions that were never asked, commented on statements that were never made, and ignored my interlocutors when they were specifically addressing me. I started having gaps in my short-term memory, like I was teleported 10 seconds into the future, and someone had taken control of my body and carried on the conversation in my place for that time. I must have looked really weird to them, but after a couple of blunders, I explained that I was on my 60th hour of uninterrupted consciousness, and I think they understood. On my way home, some of the people I perceived walking by, I don't want to say I saw them, it's more a general perception based on peripheral vision and sound, disappeared as soon as I focused on them. After I got home, I started having dreams awake. I knew they were dreams. There is a clear separation between the real world and dream world, kind of like you can imagine things and still function normally in parallel, except I had less control over what I imagined. Then, the real world and the dreams started blending together. I would accidentally move in real life like I meant to move in my dream, and it took effort and focus to differentiate between the two. I finally slept that night, after about 65 hours awake. It wasn't fun. Story 25. I had been awake for approximately 60 to 70 hours. The ground sort of moved and wobbled a bit when I stared at it for long enough. Was sitting in a bus. A couple of rows in front of me, there was sitting this bald guy. For some reason, I kind of zoned out and just stared at his bald head. I don't know if I fell asleep with my eyes open or maybe briefly closed them and dreamt it without realizing, but out of nowhere, everything around this guy's head went this kind of fluffy pink color. I saw small rainbows and flowers and stuff like that pop up around his head, much like Pyrovision from Team Fortress 2. Then this vibrant green grass started growing from his head. After a couple seconds of growing, this really cartoony looking cow sort of floated from the side with a lawnmower and mowed the hair grass on the guy's head. It was at this point I realized something probably wasn't quite right, so I looked away, looked back, and everything was normal again. Very pretty, but not very healthy. 4 out of 10. Wouldn't do it again. Story 26. I'm a retired OBGYN and have been up 36 hours hundreds of times. I've never hallucinated. It becomes difficult to do verbal tasks, so after 36 hours, I would have a pretty easy time doing surgery or scrambling an egg, but writing a simple soap note or putting a grocery list together probably took me 3 times as long as usual. The longest I was ever up was about 60 hours. No hallucinations. It was just like the 36-hour stuff, only worse. Could not keep a simple intention in my head for 15 seconds. I walked down the hospital hall and forgot which room or department I was going to. After that amount of time, coffee does not do anything for you. My partner fell asleep in an exam room while listening to a patient. Another colleague fell asleep standing while assisting at surgery and did a faceplant into the patient's open wound. The worst thing that happened to me was falling asleep on the freeway on the way home. Nothing happened. I think I was only asleep for a second or two, but it was super scary. After I retired from practice, I immediately started sleeping as much as I wanted every night. It took me about 2 months to feel like I was caught up on sleep. Story 27. I'm in the Army now, doing my mandatory military service. Just 3 weeks ago, we were having practice which lasted 8 days. I was up 73 hours in a row. It was scary as hell. We were simulating war, so other companies would try to sneak on us, and just knowing that made me hallucinate even more. I was doing a 6-hour straight guard session when the small trees next to me turned into my mates, and we started having a conversation. Lasted maybe 30 minutes. Hard to say, though. Then, one of my friends pointed out that my aim point red dot sight turned into a small elephant. At that point, I realized nothing was real. I tried to touch my friend, and he morphed into a tree. It was quite funny, and I remember laughing hysterically. It was funny how vivid the conversation felt. We were talking about something deep and personal, but it was all made by my brain. Scary crap. I didn't really feel tired, cause at that point you have to have been up so long that you can't really remember how it feels to be sober. It was scary as hell though. I never want to go to war and experience this with a real threat, that's for sure. Sorry for grammar, if there are mistakes. Story 28. I'm a nurse. Woke up one morning at my regular time. 5 a.m., worked a 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. or so. Typical day. Got home, made dinner, settled into bed, watched some TV, got a call around 10:30 p.m. Supervisor for 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. got into a car accident, and I went in thinking, okay, I can manage till 7 a.m. with some Monster or Red Bull. Busy night, but at 7 a.m., staffing is bad. Can't leave them like that. I'll just do the morning med pass and go. Roof AC unit breaks down. Hot summer day. Need to facilitate temp reports for Department of Health. Help put fans in all the rooms, find someone to fix it, etc. Some genius left a door open on the dementia unit. Now, I need to get the escapee back in the building, notify the family, file reports with DOH, secure the building. Okay, running on Red Bull and pure adrenaline. By the time that someone came to relieve me, things were getting so weird. I head home around 6 p.m. Family's in the pool, steaks are grilling. I'm so hot and so hungry. I disregard the fact that I'm struggling to get undressed and into my swimsuit. Splash around in the pool until dinner is ready. By the time I sat down to eat, seeing shadows and hearing voices, I become so paranoid and scared. Couldn't sleep until the sun comes up the next morning. Worst weekend ever. Story 29. I once stayed up for about 60 hours in a row to finish an important essay in third year college. At about the 36-hour mark, I started having intrusive thoughts about how nice it would be to slip under my duvet, rub my face against my pillow, and close my eyes. At about 48 hours, I started getting the feeling that someone was in the room watching me. When I turned around, of course, no one would be there. Over the next few hours, it gradually got worse and worse. I started feeling that the watcher was getting closer and closer to me, and every time I turned around to check if someone was there, it just seemed to get worse. It peaked just at about 56 hours in, when it felt like I could turn around and someone would be face to face with me. I felt as close to this non-existent person as if they were standing behind me with their hands on the arms of my chair, looking over my shoulder. It was some spooky crap. Then dawn broke and the feeling subsided. My spooky feeling evaporated. I finished my report, went into campus to hand it in, had a soda, spoke to a few friends, and went straight home again to catch up on sleep. My place wasn't haunted, but that 60-hour stint of no sleep and grueling effort was a journey into the unknown. It's a strange feeling, looking back at the clock and seeing it read 3:25 a.m., and knowing your work has still barely started, and that in 12 hours' time, you still won't even be halfway through your task. Story 30. It was during finals or something, I don't remember. Maybe I just had a really big paper due. Anyways, I went to bed really late one night, only getting an hour or two of sleep, and then pulled an all-nighter the next night. Managed to make it through school and most of the day. It wasn't until partway through my shift at work, mid-afternoon, that things started popping off. The first thing I noticed was when I looked down the hallway and saw my coworker standing at the other end of the hallway. I then turned around and went back into the room I came from, only to see the same coworker sitting at a table, asking me why it looked like I saw a ghost. Next thing was after my shift ended. I was so tired, it felt like my eyes were going to bleed. And while I was driving home, I saw a lamppost laying down on the side of the road. As I drove by, it smoothly stood upright. I got home, took some ibuprofen, and passed the F out. This was the only time to date where I've hallucinated purely from a lack of sleep, and it was really bizarre. Story 31. Oh my god, this one time when I was in elementary, I had insomnia all my life, much worse as a kid. I had stayed up for nearly 3 full days, and I had a friend over for a sleepover in my basement. I know how creepy that sounds, but we really just had no other place to sleep, LMAO. My friend would not stop rambling about her dog, and I was trying my best to stay away all night again so we could hang out. Never in my life have I ever fallen asleep first at a sleepover, but I was drifting off and then coming back awake and then drifting off again, trying to desperately stay awake while she was talking. What I saw in the dark corner of my basement were these strange tiki men. Like, they had these weird ski masks and hula grass skirts and everything. All the while, my friend is just chatting away casually. I guess in that time I had fallen asleep for good, because my dumbass friend thought that the best way to wake me back up was to pour candy sugar tubes, pixie sticks, in my nose and mouth because it'd give me a sugar rush. All it did was make me choke and make up freaking the F out, and my mom ran downstairs. Needless to say, that friendship didn't work out for long as a kid. Story 32. Was working at a crappy call center. I was the overnight manager, and some people had called in sick, so they needed me to cover during the day. Ended up working for 3 days straight with only 2 3-hour-long breaks. At the end of the endurance run of near slave labor, my good friend was having a party that I had previously agreed to go to. I caught a ride to the party with another friend. Don't remember anything about that night, except that I asked my ride to take me home early because I was getting paranoid about something. Don't remember what. I was hallucinating. In the car ride home, I tried to shut my eyes to sleep, but all the caffeine I had ingested to stay awake for the party wouldn't let me actually go to sleep. I recall seeing a snowman running towards me really fast, which, aside from the obvious ridiculousness, makes even less sense in the middle of summer in Florida. Didn't really have much other memories of that night, though. I had been awake for over 80 hours without REM sleep. Vowed to never subject myself to that kind of sleep deprivation torture ever again. It took years for me to recover from working that overnight shift job. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. I put recover in quotes because even though I now have a regular sleep schedule, my personality had been permanently altered by the experience. Story 33. It was the first semester of the second year of my physics degree, which is probably the hardest semester in the course as it's when the big guns maths makes an appearance and a lot of other hard stuff gets laid on. Anyway, this is when my body decided it was time to develop crippling insomnia. When it's bad, you're never truly awake or asleep when you do finally crash out. You're in some sort of semi-lucid limbo where you're never really sure if what you're experiencing has really happened, and if it did, how much time has passed since you acknowledge it consciously. The course itself was pretty high contact time, 25 hours per week, including lab and tutorials, so there often wasn't really much point going home between lectures, leading to a lot of time being spent in the common room. During this time, I've started to have hallucinations while understimulated between lectures/lab, which I guess was my brain trying to decompress. Nothing too wild at first, just improbable people using the vending machine and then disappearing. Eventually, the improbable people would start talking to me, which I would ignore. One day, I came around to a girl on my course waving her hand in front of my face while saying hello. "Are you okay?" over and over. I thought she was a hallucination and ignored her. When it clicked that she wasn't a hallucination, I said, "Oh, sorry, I thought you weren't real," which led to some odd looks from her. She explained that I had been blankly staring into space for a good 10 minutes. It was at this point that I decided medical intervention was needed. Props to you for realizing that there was an issue afoot here and seeking medical intervention. A lot of the people that we have read so far have not chosen or elected to go that path, so I just wanted to shout out taking care of yourself is important. Story 34. When we had our first kid, I was wholly unprepared for that kind of lack of sleep. We were getting up to feed him every 2 hours or something to get his weight up. I had to help keep him awake. Son was there every time and awake even when my wife dozed off. I also took it upon myself to do most of the diaper changes so my wife could sleep. We did some stuff in shifts, but it didn't really work well. So I would get 4 hours of broken sleep a night for weeks on end. Things started to shift just out of the corner of my eye, sometimes alarmingly so, and if jump at nothing. I was struggling to think clearly. Eventually, it became very moody and felt like I was watching a movie of myself at times. I remember being out walking on a windy day and stopping in my tracks because I thought some trees were blowing over in front of me. It was not at all that windy. Then I realized they just kept falling without hitting the ground, and then figured out it was some weird hallucination caused by the trees leaning and swaying in the wind, and I just wasn't registering the slight rebound as it swayed back and forth. I thought that one was kind of funny at least. It was a mess and partly out of my gourd for months. But that was in the worst stretch shortly after I started working again. Story 35. Background to both. I was about 21 at the time, waking up at 3 a.m. to do milk deliveries to stores in my refrigerated truck. Hard labor, long drives between areas, mainly rural, and long hours. After which, I would go visit my girlfriend who lived on her family ranch, and I would often stay there until 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. So, not enough sleep. I developed narcolepsy that stayed with me for a year or two after. Also, in case it comes up, I did not drink back then, nor do recreational drugs. I was a good Christian boy in those days. Story 1. The Crocolisk. I was driving to my apartment, 1:30 a.m., small country town in Texas. I go down a hill and start going across the low water crossing near my place. All of a sudden, what the F is that? I slam on my brakes, squealing the tires and swerving near the edge. Emerging from the water without a ripple was a crocolisk. Yeah, from World of Warcraft, which had come out the same year, and I was also spending time playing. The thing was a good 15 feet long and built like a tank. Crazy realistic detail. I didn't think it was from World of Warcraft in that moment. There's just a monster moving across the road, my headlight shining on it, womping its way across the bridge. I almost crashed into it, nearly crapped my pants. It slid quietly into the water on the other side after it briefly swiveled its head and hissed at me. I sat there shaking for a good minute trying to figure out what happened. It was so real. I heard it, saw it. It interacted with the environment, but another part of my mind told me there was no way a six-legged ancient crocodilian creature was alive and living unnoticed in the river running through town. It's still real in my mind. Story 2. The flashing red ghost lights, or the curious case of the police anti-abduction. It's 2 months after the crocolisk. I have been trying to do better with sleep and rest. That night and the previous few days, I had been doing really well. 5 hours of solid rest, which was good at the time, eating better, leaving by around 10 p.m. to drive home, etc. This night was a little later, 10:45 p.m., weekday. I'm feeling good. I was even reflecting on how much improvement I had in my driving fatigue. After about 15 minutes, I come to the same low water crossing a few blocks from my apartment that had the crocolisk, which I thought of every time I cross now. After the low water crossing, you go to the other side and hit a T-junction with a red light on a rural road. The light had no sensor, with a messed up timer after a certain time, leading to a good 2-minute wait doing nothing, waiting for it to change. Police loved it. They would get people running it all the time. So I pull up to the light. I'm waiting there a good minute. I ponder running it myself, and look around to see if I can see any other vehicles. Then the light starts blinking. I think. Power outage. Not too unusual. I look around, ready to go. Then I notice the cabin of my car is flashing bright red. It's filling my entire cabin. It was freaky as hell. Country road, flashing red lights filling my car. I know how this goes. Abduction and butt probe coming up. I'm concerned, a bit frightened. I'm ready to peel out of there. Then, bam, 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 bam. Something was hitting my car right next to me. I could feel it. Once again, on the same stretch of road, I nearly pissed myself. Then I woke up in the middle of the road, and there is a sheriff shining his flashlight at me. He was banking on my door. The lights in the cabin, the flashing lights of the police cruiser behind me right at my bumper. I was indeed at the intersection, passed out. I had a manual and was on level ground, so it was not moving anywhere. Son, you all right? Hey, don't close your eyes again. Son, roll down your window, right now. I roll it down, and I know I'm effed. He asked if I was on drugs or drinking. No, it was evident quickly that I hadn't taken anything. His demeanor changed. He was surprisingly amazing. As the officer explained it, they had been following me for almost a mile. I was swerving everywhere, almost went off the low water crossing. Then I just rolled to a stop, right there. They had tried to call me on their speaker to get me out, and it wasn't happening. That's when he got out, left his partner in the car to watch, and when he saw me, he thought I was OD'd. I gave him the 15-second version of long hours, late nights, and recently developing narcolepsy. He asked if I lived nearby, and if I thought I could make it home. I said yes, and he and his partner escorted me to the gates of my apartment. No arrest, no ticket, and to this day, I'm still grateful for how they handled it. Epilogue. Shortly after these, I started drifting while driving the big truck on the country roads between towns. I saw a doctor, got a prescription, but I knew the road so well, and it became possible for me to keep driving and dreaming. I was alert and awake on some stretches. It felt real, but it wasn't. On a bright afternoon, I was feeling pretty good. Blue sky, puffy clouds, making good time. Then I hear honking and swerving. For a moment, I thought someone behind me got in a wreck. Then my eyes suddenly snapped open. I was driving in the oncoming lane of a 2-lane road. I had drifted off and ran a family off the road. I corrected and pulled over. They weren't hurt. Luckily, it was a flat ground and fields. They waved me off with the middle finger in some well-deserved language. I was shaking for a good 10 minutes before I could continue. I called my boss up that day and told him I was resigning and they needed someone to drive with me until I was replaced. Story 36. Leading up to the days of my son being born, I stayed up about 4 days, maybe had 1 to 1.5 hours of sleep. It was a rough process as she was having complications, which ultimately resulted in a C-section. Immediately after the delivery, I went back to work, because, bills. I would be talking to my coworker and randomly hear him saying things he swore he didn't say. I would doze off in the middle of talking, forget what I was saying mid-sentence, forget to do simple tasks people told me to do literally a couple seconds ago, and forget where I was going when walking, i.e. going to the break room for lunch or car when I forgot my phone charger, which I would also forget why I even came to the car once I remembered to go to the car. Overall, it was pretty terrible, and I didn't start feeling bad until I returned to work. Note, my boss allowed me to just take a couple more days off, which turned into weeks because it turns out having kids is hard. Story 38. I had a severe shoulder injury that I was fighting to get diagnosed. Walking hurt, sitting hurt, laying down hurt, breathing hurt, existing was pain. It was bad enough that I wouldn't sleep for 4 to 5 days at a time. I would literally just drop from exhaustion and eventually wake up from the pain after 6 or so hours. The hallucinations came pretty quickly after 72 hours. Shadow people, texts that weren't there, people talking to me, monsters, dogs, cats. The worst was pretty bad. The TV went staticky and I couldn't move. This thing made of static in the shape of a person crawled out and sat on the bed next to me. It told me that I shouldn't be alive. A few months before getting hurt, I had a very, very vivid dream where I committed not alive. I can remember every detail, even now, 8 years later. Then I woke up at home, figured it was nothing. The static thing told me it wasn't a dream. I died, or I should have. Basically, the world glitched, and I wound up in a slightly different version of reality where I didn't go through with it. Static thing told me that I'm basically an irritant on the world, like when a grain of sand gets an oyster and starts trying to get rid of it. The world would start doing it to me because I'm not supposed to be here. It was polite and kind about it, but it told me I need to die because things will slowly get worse around me until I do. I can still remember its voice, kept seeing it everywhere for a while until I got my shoulder fixed. The sound of static still makes me sick because of it. Seeing a staticky TV basically causes me to inwardly panic. Sketchy thing is, my life has progressively gotten worse since then, and there's that little voice in my head wondering if it was actually a hallucination or if it's why I now have phenomenally bad luck. Yeah, fun times. Story 39. Yes, often. I have RSD/CRPS along with a few other physical ailments. In addition to causing endless burning pain because it's caused by dysfunction of the sympathetic nervous system, CRPS messes with the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism of your brain, and you can't sleep when you're in pain and/or breathing in adrenaline. I'm prescribed sleeping tablets, but frankly, once a bad cycle starts, nothing stops it but time. They even gave me ketamine in hospital once, and I just chatted with the guy dispensing it. They weren't trying to get me to sleep, but they were hoping I would because it had been a good 6 weeks with 2 bouts of sleep I can remember. Generally by day 3, I have oral hallucinations. It was my mom calling me from downstairs, despite living on another continent. Once it was that horrid air raid siren from Silent Hill. Now it's my baby crying. This continues for about a week, then I'll drop for about 8 hours. And a few times it's done it again, hence the sleeping tablets. You're not meant to be on them long term, but an exception was made in my case. During the bad times, I must be microsleeping, but I'm unaware of it. Anyway, except for those oral hallucinations and shadows I sometimes see moving in my peripheral vision, the hallucinations aren't bad. I know I'm hallucinating, so at least I'm not losing the plot, and I'm used to it. I know I'm doing long-term damage to my brain, though, but it's out of my hands. Story 40. I once worked a week-long summer camp that went seriously off the rails, like kids lost in a foreign country levels of bad, like fire festival levels of bad. The first night we were there, we had an incident where all the kids' luggage was sent to a single hostel. Not the hostel we were staying at either. We took a bus to pick it up, but it wasn't all labeled either, so we sort of had to guess whose was whose. That took all night. Day 2, we did some walking tours, but it was Sunday, and all the stores in the area were closed and we couldn't get any water for the kids. Someone ended up driving more than 50 miles to buy bulk water bottles from a highway rest area. That night we had a 1 a.m. staff meeting that went until almost 4. I ended up staying up to try and hammer out some more organization, since we had a kid go missing when he was, in fact, asleep in bed the whole time. By day 3, I hadn't slept even a wink in more than 48 hours, and my happy face for the kids was fading. I cried into my computer for close to half an hour talking to one of those other staffers about how much of a disaster this was turning out to be. His name was Andy, and he and I had staffed for the camp together before. That night, I went to sleep and slept maybe 3 hours before waking up for another 1 a.m. staff meeting. I told everyone in the room how Andy and I had worked out a few ideas earlier in the day while we were exasperated. Everyone was confused because nobody named Andy was on this trip. In fact, nobody named Andy even worked for them. Andy was someone I'd worked with at a completely different summer camp 3 years earlier and hadn't even spoken to in a year. I hallucinated that entire conversation. To this day, I vividly remember talking to Andy in that room. Story 41. Yep, working in Telecom on cell sites is a tough game. We had to work all day on a tower hauling new equipment and stuff like that. Then my top hand, like a second in command to the foreman, me at the time, and I had to do a maintenance window project at a different site in the city. We ran into lots of issues that night and ended up working all night. Then the management wanted the first site to be completed that day, and the rest of our crew was rested and ready to go. You wouldn't leave two techs on a site alone without a foreman or top hand. So we just drove back to the first site. My second and I ended up working until 10 p.m. that night. When I was driving back, I was hallucinating hard. The people's red taillights of those in front of me started morphing into bunnies or deer or clouds, just really random things. All the other lights were tracing and leaving trails. Very nerve-wracking. Being from that industry, that certainly wasn't my first or last time working myself into hallucinations. We called it seeing the black dog. The cellular game is much underrated and unknown to a lot of people. It's one of the most dangerous jobs you can do. I commonly had to work these 24 to 36 hour shifts to keep on schedule. And on top of that, slinging around hundreds of pounds of steel when you're hanging off a 300-foot tower is pretty damn physically demanding. I miss those days, and I don't miss those days. It was the most fun I never want to have again. Story 42. I share a room with my sister, and we sleep at the same ends of our bed, so we can look at each other and talk sometimes. One time I stayed up for 42 hours straight, and I was trying to finish my paper. I was sitting in my bed at night and using the light of my laptop to type. Anyway, we have street lights in our neighborhood that kind of illuminate the room enough to see our faces at times. So I was doing my work, pulling absolute bat crap out of my ass for this paper, and for some reason I looked up and saw my sister's face. It was weird because it was 3 a.m. and she's usually asleep, but there she was, staring dead at me. I squinted to make sure I wasn't tripping, but her eyes were wide open, unnaturally so. I called out her name, and she didn't answer. I got spooked and wanted to close my eyes because it was so scary. I started to turn my laptop, and all of a sudden, it looked like she was blinking wildly before the light got to her. When the light got to her, I saw that her back was facing me. She wasn't even facing me, but I saw her face clear as day. I decided to say F deadlines. It was time to sleep, with the closet lights on. Story 43. I've done it somewhat on the regular for various reasons, although I've never got to the point of demon faces and stuff that some people talk about. I used to work at an abandoned manor, old rundown thing, and spent a lot of time in the dark. Was a good laugh and got along with my coworkers, so it was pretty common that we would stay up late, drinking most nights, and would shotgun energy drinks the next day like it was water for days on end. Don't think my liver has recovered yet still. I think it was 3 to 4 day one, and I start seeing 3 lights floating around at above head height in one of the old corridors. At first I thought it was pikeys or something, so I followed after it to the woods on the grounds. I'm convinced I can hear something, scraping along the leaves and crap on the ground, and the lights appear again, and there's this shadowy figure, about 7 feet tall with these 3 pins of light about 10 meters in front of me. I stop dead, and I'm effing terrified until it slowly dawns on me I've been up 3 to 4 days. I blink a few times and the lights disappear and I'm staring at the space between trees. Then there's ones when I've been on stag and convinced there's a bunch of people out and about watching you, although I know that's pretty common. Takes a lot out of you to just focus in and double check before calling it in. Or you catch shadows in the corner of your vision that you spend ages trying to chase down only for your buddy to tell you it was a bush or a rock. I think the worst ones for that are when something is there, like a burnt out car in the dark though, and your brain just projects this image onto it, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, even though every fiber in your body is telling it can't reasonably be there. Being tired and in the dark seriously F's with your head, man. Sends that fight or flight impulse in your monkey brain into overdrive. Story 44. Late to the party, but once I was driving home from a festival, Hudson Project, the first one when there was torrential downpours that rained out the last day of shows. Was up all night trying to get the hell out of there, and I did a bunch of stuff I probably shouldn't the day before the rain started. Finally got out of the muddy hell that was the parking lot at about midnight. Anyway, driving back to civilization, I was dead tired, probably dehydrated as well. My car mates were all up, so they could keep me awake, but it was a struggle. Was going down a stretch of road, and there were no other cars on the road, but all of a sudden I swore I saw what appeared to be a cow or deer or something sprint across the highway in front of my car. I swerved a bit and then I blinked and realized that it was a hallucination. Nothing bad happened, and we did get home safe, but the kid in the back seat was on my ass the whole rest of the ride, just chatting to keep me alert. God bless that kid, and honestly, F the people who put on that crap show and then left a bunch of college kids to fend for themselves. Story 45. Went on a surprise road trip over a couple days to Alabama to go to the beach. It was about an 8-hour drive. I decided to stay awake to keep the driver company, and seeing as we were taking a vacation, I said F it and just stayed up the whole weekend. After 2 days or so of being awake, I told my friends to leave me on the beach and I'd just chill. They drove a few miles back to our campsite, and I walked along the water for a while just enjoying the waves, and accidentally interrupting some teens getting frisky under a pier. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in my chair, watching the moon reflect off the waves, and it looked like the water was filled with thousands of shiny silver fish dancing in the moonlight. I realized I was not going to make it another couple of hours and didn't want to wake up at like 10 a.m. as red as a lobster, so I walked miles in the inky darkness past various signs warning of gators to the campgrounds. Story 46. Around day 5 post-heart surgery, I was watching a Netflix Norm McDonald special in my hospital bed when he started talking about me, using my name in his bits, and then talking directly to me. He then stepped out of my laptop and walked around on my bed, still laptop-sized, doing parts of his routine, and then the words he would say became word bubbles, like in comic books. He eventually took some of the words and smashed them to bits, because he told me they were meaningless. After smashing the extraneous parts of the English language, Norm looked out of my hospital room window and told me the world wasn't real. To prove it, he punched the window and the world shattered into bits. He then told me that I was actually dead and died during surgery. I woke up or came out of it, and he was back in my laptop and all was back to normal. I pushed the call button for nurses, but they didn't come, so I waited about 15 minutes. Unsure if I was a ghost or a living person anymore, and walked into the hallway, dragging the equipment I was hooked up to with me. Once someone stopped me, I was incredibly thankful to them for confirming that I was, in fact, alive. So first of all, great to hear that recovery after the heart surgery went well. I don't know why, this is just a funny story. Like, there's hallucinations, and then there's like things that legitimately sound like someone's making them up, and therefore that's why they're so believable and funny. So thank you for sharing that.